History is not always written in books. Some stories live in whispers, are remembered in silence. This video is one of those stories. Listen before you fall asleep, because some truths can only be heard when you are close to sleep.
The Franklin Expedition. 129 men lost in the ice. That day at the port of London, no one knew that these ships would never return. On the morning of May 19, 1845, as the fog slowly lifted over the River Thames, two massive ships departed from the dock, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. The most powerful, most modern ships of the British Royal Navy. On their decks stood 129 men, their hands seemingly tied behind their backs, waving to their families. Some were smiling, some were silently gazing at the sky. No one knew that this was the final farewell. Commander Sir John Franklin was a 60-year-old experienced explorer. Behind him were dozens of expeditions, years spent among the glaciers. But this time was different. This time, he would make history. He would find the Northwest Passage, the legendary route opening from the Atlantic to the Pacific. That narrow waterway sought for centuries and never found. And Franklin was the man who would succeed. As the ships left the harbor, the crowd dispersed. Mothers cried, children ran, but the ships were gone. Slowly, resolutely, toward the unknown. Inside them were 3 years' worth of food, canned meat, biscuits, soup, also thousands of liters of rum, wine, and lemon juice against scurvy. The ships were so well equipped that no one thought anything could go wrong. They even had engines, steam-powered ice-breaking machines, a miracle of modern science. But the sea never cared about science. July 1845. The ships were seen off the coast of Greenland. A whaling vessel spotted Erebus and Terror moving through the ice. Franklin handed letters to the whaling ship, to their families, their loved ones. Everything is fine. Morale is high. We will soon find the Northwest Passage. The letters reached London. The British public read them with joy, but after those letters, no one ever heard from Franklin again. As the silence stretched, concern grew. 1 year passed, 2 years, 3 years, no news. The Royal Navy took action. Search parties were sent. 1, 2, 3. Dozens of ships scoured the northern coasts of Canada, but they found nothing. Only silence, only ice, only the howl of the wind. But in truth, among those glaciers, something terrible had happened. Something that was slowly destroying Franklin and his men. The winter of 1846. The ships were trapped by ice off King William Island. The sailors had expected this. It happened every winter. Ships froze, the ice melted in spring, and the journey continued. But this time was different. The ice did not melt. The ships remained stuck where they were. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Summer came, but the ice did not move. The ships were imprisoned within a vast sheet of ice. Franklin tried to remain calm. He boosted his men's morale. Do not worry. We have 3 years' worth of supplies. The ice will surely melt next summer. But deep down, he was anxious, because the ships could no longer move, and with each passing day, the cold grew a little stronger. At night, the men standing watch on deck gazed at the northern lights. Green, purple, blue. The sky was dancing, but that dance felt like a warning, the final beauty nature showed to humanity. because after that, there was only darkness. Spring of 1847, Franklin died. Exactly how he died is not known. Perhaps a heart attack, perhaps the cold, perhaps something else. But when he died, command passed to Francis Crozier. Crozier was an Irish sailor, tough, disciplined, cold-blooded. But even he did not know what to do, because the ships were still trapped in the ice, and the supplies were running out. The canned food began to spoil because it was sealed with lead. The lead slowly seeped into the food, and the men began to suffer from lead poisoning, headaches, nausea, weakness. Some began to behave strangely. Some became forgetful. Others began to lose their minds. But the worst was scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, the greatest enemy of sailors. Teeth fell out, flesh rotted, wounds would not heal. The men were slowly wasting away. Some became so weak that they could no longer walk. They lay on the deck, staring at the sky, quietly dying. Crozier made his decision. April 22, 1848. They would abandon the ships. They would head south over land. They would reach a settlement, a fort, a place of help. 105 men remained. The others were already dead. Crozier left a note. He placed it inside a metal cylinder. HMS Erebus and Terror abandoned off King William Island. 105 men marching south. May God help us. That morning, the men disembarked from the ships. They looked at the deck one last time. One last look at the mast, the sails, the helm. Then they turned and began to walk. They carried food bags, blankets, rifles. But it was not enough, because ahead of them lay hundreds of kilometers of ice, and none of them would reach it. The first days were hard, but seemed manageable. The snow was soft, the wind light. But then the storm began. Snow lashed their faces, the cold cut into their bones, the wind stole their breath. Some fell. They did not get back up. Their companions left them there because they had no strength to carry them. Each day, a few more men died from exhaustion, from cold, from hunger. They left the bodies on the ice because there was no soil to bury them. There was only ice, endless, merciless ice. But in truth, the most horrifying thing came later. The food ran out. The men were so hungry that they could no longer endure it. And then the darkest side of human nature emerged. Cannibalism. Yes, that terrible word, but there was no other choice, to die or to eat. Some ate the flesh of their dead companions to survive, but it did not save them, because cannibalism is something that kills not only the body, but the soul as well. What became of Crozier is unknown. Perhaps he died. Perhaps he went mad. Perhaps he froze somewhere and remained there, but he was never found. Of the 105 men, none survived. All of them were lost in the ice. Years passed. Search parties began to find traces, a boat, a tent, a skeleton. In the 1850s, bodies were found on King William Island. Some were mummified. The cold had preserved them. Their faces were still visible, their eyes still half open, as if they were still walking, as if they were still heading south. In 1854, an explorer named John Ray received information from the Inuit people. The locals said they had seen white men years earlier. They were walking, they were thin, they were deranged, and some of them had eaten human flesh. When Ray sent this information to London, the British public was shocked. They denied it. Our heroes would never do such a thing, they said. But the truth was the truth, and that truth was painful. For a century, the traces of the Franklin expedition continued to be sought. Some carried hope, others only curiosity. But the full truth was never learned, because those 129 men had left their secrets in the ice. When the century turned, scientists began to examine the bodies. There were cut marks on the bones, evidence of cannibalism. The lead levels were also very high. The canned food had killed them, slowly, silently, and scurvy, cold, hunger, tuberculosis, all at once, a horrific cocktail of death. In 2014, thanks to modern technology, the ship HMS Erebus was found, on the seabed, almost perfectly preserved. In 2016, HMS Terror was found as well. Both ships seemed as if they had been frozen in a moment when time itself had stopped. Inside them were plates, spoons, buttons, books, traces of the men's final moments. But it was never fully known what happened in those last days. What did the men think? What did they feel? What did they see in their final moments? Snow or a memory? Their families or only darkness? Perhaps some things are never meant to be known. Perhaps the 129 men lost in the ice will keep their secrets forever. Perhaps this is their peace, because the truth is sometimes heavier than silence. And so the Franklin expedition remained one of the greatest mysteries in history. A warning, a reminder of how fragile humanity is in the face of nature's power, but also a testament to human courage, hope, and the instinct to survive. Today, the wind still blows on King William Island. Snow still falls, and on some nights, the northern lights still dance, as if the spirits of those 129 men are still walking there, still heading south, still trying to return home. But they will never arrive, because their home is now those glaciers, forever. That night, the captain of the Erebus, Francis Crozier, sat in his cabin, writing in his journal by candlelight. His hands were trembling from the cold and from fear, but he had to show that he was not afraid, because he was now the leader, and leaders do not fear. May 19th, 1845. We set out. Everyone was cheerful. So was I. But now, 3 years later, nothing is the same. Franklin is dead. The ships are trapped. The men are ill. And I do not know what to do.
He blew out the candle. Darkness enveloped the cabin, and in that darkness, only the howl of the wind could be heard. Outside the ship, the ice creaked and groaned, as if the ship were being slowly crushed, as if nature were pulling it into itself. But Crozier would not give up. Tomorrow, he would speak to the men. They would make plans. Perhaps they would abandon the ships and walk. Perhaps the ice would melt. Perhaps another ship would come. Perhaps. But those perhaps were growing fewer and fewer. The truth was this: they were condemned, and the condemned can only wait. That night, on the deck, James Fitzjames stood watching the stars. The sky was clear. The northern lights were shimmering. Green, purple, blue waves, as if heaven were dancing with the earth. Fitzjames closed his eyes and thought of home.
England, green hills, gentle sunshine, tea gardens, his mother, his siblings, his house. How far away it was now, how unreachable. He heard a sound, a faint crackling. Ice, always ice. But this time it was different, as if the ice was moving. He listened closely. Yes, it was definitely moving. A spark of hope. Perhaps the ice was breaking. Perhaps spring was coming. But no, it was only an illusion. The ice was not moving. It was just the wind sweeping snow across the surface of the ice. And that snow struck Fitzjames's face, blinding his eyes. He went inside. Warm but damp air. The interior of the ship smelled of moisture, of decay, illness, death. Some men lay in their bunks, coughing. Some were quietly praying. Others were simply staring at the ceiling, with empty, meaningless eyes. Fitzjames lay down in his bunk. He pulled the blanket over himself, but the cold still seeped into him, because this cold did not come from outside. It came from within, from his soul, the cold of hopelessness. And that night, all 129 men felt the same despair. They all knew, but no one spoke, because to speak was to accept, and to accept was to die. But the truth was the truth, and that truth was drawing closer every day.
The summer of 1847. The ice melted a little, but it was not enough. The ships were still trapped. Crozier sent out a scouting party, south over land, to find a relief point, a fort, a settlement. But the party returned empty-handed. There was nothing, only empty, endless whiteness, only ice, snow, and wind. Then Crozier understood the terrible reality. Help would not come. No one was looking for them. Perhaps everyone believed they were already dead, and perhaps they were right. I must tell the men, but what should I say? Should I say there is no hope? Should I say we will all die? No, never. A leader gives hope, not fear. But later that night, when he was alone in his cabin, Crozier cried, silently, so no one would hear, because leaders do not cry. But he was no longer just a leader. He was a frightened, helpless, lonely man. Spring of 1848. The ice did not melt again. The supplies were completely gone. The canned meat was finished. Only flour, a little soup powder, and a few bags of biscuits remained. But this would only last the 105 men a few weeks. What would happen then? Crozier made his decision. They would abandon the ships. On April 22, each man would take what he could carry: food, blankets, weapons, ammunition. Then they would walk south to the back river, from there to a settlement. They would walk because there was no other choice. That morning, the men gathered on the deck. Their faces were pale, their eyes tired, but they were still standing, still fighting. Crozier addressed them. "Gentlemen, today we are abandoning these ships. We will walk south. It will be hard, but we will succeed, because we are the finest men of the British Royal Navy, and we never give up." The men listened in silence. No one applauded. No one smiled. They simply nodded, because they all knew this was not a beginning. This was the final march. As they disembarked, some looked back. Erebus,
and Terror, those beautiful ships. Now they were like ghosts, abandoned, lonely, forlorn, as if they too knew that they would never sail again.
The march began. On the first day, they covered 10 kilometers. It was exhausting, but manageable. On the second day, 8 kilometers. On the third day, 5 kilometers. Each day, they slowed down a little more, because each day they grew a little weaker. On the fourth day, the first man fell. He did not get back up. His companions stood beside him. They looked on in silence. Then they continued, because to stop was to die. On the fifth day, 3 more men fell. On the sixth day, 5 men. On the seventh day, 8 men. The bodies were lining the ice, as if they were leaving a trail of death. Crozier was now struggling to walk. His feet were swollen. He was short of breath, but he did not stop, because the moment he stopped, everyone would stop, and the moment everyone stopped, everyone would die. The 10th day, the food was gone, completely. There was no flour, no biscuits, no soup powder, only snow. The men ate snow, but snow only eased the pain temporarily. The stomach still burned, the intestines still cramped. The 15th day, some men began to look at the bodies of their dead companions. They stared for a long time, then they turned away, but those looks said everything. Hunger had reached its limit. The 18th day, the first case of cannibalism. One man cut a piece from the arm of his dead companion, cooked it over a fire, ate it. He cried, but he ate, because he wanted to live, because a human being can do anything to survive. The other men saw it. Some were disgusted, some turned away, but some did the same. And so that sacred rule was broken. Man ate man, and the world grew a little darker. When Crozier saw this, he buried his face in his hands. He did not cry. He just sat and waited, because there was nothing left to do. Leadership was over. There was only the instinct to survive. The 21st day, the group split in 2. Some went west, some south. There was no unity anymore. There was no plan anymore. There was only chaos. 25th day. Crozier continued walking with his last strength. Only 2 men remained beside him. Where were the others? Dead or lost? He did not know, and he no longer cared. He just walked. 1 foot forward, then the other. 1 foot forward, then the other. The 30th day. He was alone. The 2 men were gone as well. Perhaps they had died. Perhaps they had gone another way. But Crozier was alone, in the endless whiteness, completely alone. The wind was blowing. Snow was falling. The cold was cutting into his bones, but he no longer felt it, because the body was no longer working. Only the soul was making one last struggle. He fell onto the snow, face down. He did not get up. He could not get up. He just lay there and looked at the sky. The northern lights were dancing, green, purple, blue. They were beautiful, very beautiful, as if heaven were calling to him. He closed his eyes and took one final breath, a deep, long breath. Then, silence. Francis Crozier died, but where exactly is not known.
His body was never found. Perhaps it was buried under the snow. Perhaps it was carried into the sea. Perhaps elsewhere. But his story ended here. And thus, the 129 men died, one by one. Some on the ships, some on the ice, some while heading south. All with the same despair, the same silence, and all were lost in the pages of history. But in truth, the story did not end here, because the echoes of the Franklin expedition lasted for years, in London, in homes, in families, waiting women, hopeful children, crying mothers. All believed their loved ones would return, but no one came. Lady Jane Franklin, the wife of Sir John Franklin, never gave up. For years she financed search expeditions. She pressured the government. She placed notices in newspapers, "Find my husband, find my men." But as the years passed, hope faded.
In the 1850s, the first traces began to be found. 3 graves on Beechey Island: John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Braine, the first victims of the Franklin expedition. They had died in the winter of 1846. When the graves were opened, the bodies were in perfect condition. The permafrost had preserved them. Their faces were pale, their eyes closed, as if they were sleeping. But those graves were only the beginning. The true tragedy was farther south, on King William Island. There, dozens of skeletons were found, some beside tents, some inside boats, some simply out in the open, all facing south, as if even in their final breath, they were trying to go home. In 1854, John Ray's report shook England, the claim of cannibalism. The British public could not accept it. "Our heroes would never do such a thing. This is a lie. This is slander." But Ray was not lying. The Inuit had told the truth, and that truth was horrifying. Lady Jane Franklin attacked Ray. She had articles published in newspapers. "My husband would never do such a thing. My men would never do such a thing." But as the years passed, the evidence grew, and in the end, everyone was forced to accept the truth. In 1859, an explorer named Leopold McClintock made a crucial discovery on King William Island: a metal cylinder. Inside it, a note, Crozier's note. April 22, 1848, HMS Erebus and Terror abandoned off King William Island. 9 officers and 15 men dead. The remaining 105 men will begin marching south tomorrow. May God help us. That note was the final official record of the Franklin expedition. After that, there was only silence. The 105 men vanished. None survived. McClintock also found a boat. Inside it were 2 skeletons. The boat had been abandoned while being dragged south. Inside were strange items: silver cutlery, silk handkerchiefs, soap, as if the men had set out as though going to a drawing room. But they did not go to a drawing room. They went to their deaths. The story of that boat summarized the tragedy of the Franklin expedition: unpreparedness, arrogance, underestimating nature. The men were traveling with unnecessary burdens: silver tableware, silk clothing, but they had no food, no water, no hope. In 1869, an American explorer named Charles Hall gathered more information. He listened to stories from the Inuit.
about the final days of the white men. Some had been seen near the ships, deranged, unable to speak. Some were carrying their dead companions. Others were simply eating snow. One Inuit woman told Hall this: "The white men were very weak. They could not walk. Some were crawling on the ground. We wanted to help, but they did not understand us. They only shouted. Then they walked away, and we never saw them again." Hall recorded those stories, but no one listened, because the British public still did not want to accept the truth. Their heroes could not have died like this, but they did, and they suffered greatly. In the 1870s and 1880s, more skeletons were found. Some still had clothing on them, naval uniforms, names, ranks, but most were just bare bones, remains destroyed by wind, snow, and time. At the beginning of the 20th century, Roald Amundsen successfully traversed the Northwest Passage, the first human to do so. But he did not use Franklin's route, because Franklin's route was a path of death. Amundsen used a more southern, narrower passage, and he succeeded. Amundsen showed respect for the Franklin expedition. "They are our pioneers. With their courage, they showed us the way. Even though they failed, they are heroes." But heroism does not ease the pain. It only makes it forgotten. In 1984, a Canadian anthropologist named Owen Beatty went to Beechey Island. He opened the 3 graves: John Torrington, John Hartnell, and William Brain. Even after 138 years, the bodies were in perfect condition. Beatty took samples: hair, bone, tissue. The laboratory results were shocking. Lead levels were 10 times higher than normal. The lead used in sealing the cans had seeped into the food. The men had been slowly poisoned. Lead poisoning causes mental confusion, physical weakness, and eventually death. Perhaps this was why some of the men made strange decisions. Perhaps this was why they carried silver tableware. Perhaps this was why they ate one another. In 1992, an archaeologist named Anne Keenlyside examined more skeletons on King William Island. There were cut marks on the bones, made with knives to separate muscle, evidence of cannibalism. It could no longer be denied. But Keenlyside also noticed something else. Some skeletons were extremely emaciated. The bones had thinned like paper. Scurvy, tuberculosis, pneumonia, everything at once. The men had not died only of starvation. They had died of disease as well. In 2008, an underwater archaeologist named Robert Grenier began searching for Franklin's ships. He searched for years, but he could not find them because the Arctic Sea was very deep and very cold. But finally, in 2014, a miracle happened. HMS Erebus was found at the bottom of the Victoria Strait at a depth of 11 meters. The ship was almost perfectly preserved. Its mast, deck, cabins, everything was in place, as if the crew had left for just a single day. Diving teams entered the ship. Plates, spoons, bottles. In one cabin, there was a table. Objects were still on it. In another cabin, a bed. A blanket lay on it, as if someone were sleeping there. But there was no one, only silence. And that silence summarized the tragedy of the Franklin expedition. In 1992, HMS Terror was also found in Terror Bay at a depth of 24 meters. This ship was even better preserved than Erebus. The doors were closed, tablecloths, drawers, shelves, everything was orderly, as if the crew could return at any moment. But they never returned, because they were already dead.
The discovery of both ships brought the Franklin expedition back into the world's spotlight. Documentaries were made, books were written, exhibitions were opened, but still, the full truth was not known. The final days of 129 men were still a mystery. Scientists examined the findings from the ships. They searched for journals, letters, notes, but nothing was found. Perhaps the seawater had destroyed them. Perhaps the men had destroyed them before abandoning the ships. Or perhaps they had never existed at all. Because sometimes the truth is not written, it is only lived. And Franklin's men had lived the truth until their final breath. In 2019, Inuit communities began to tell the story of the Franklin expedition from their own perspective, because they had been there in those days. They had seen the white men. They had tried to help them. An elderly Inuit told this: "My grandfather said he saw the white men. They were very weak. They looked very sick. We gave them food, fish, seal meat, but they did not eat. Maybe they did not like our food. Maybe they were too weak from hunger to eat. We don't know. They just looked at it. Then they left, and we never saw them again." That story was an irony within the tragedy, because the Inuit had lived in that region for thousands of years. They knew how to survive in the cold. They knew what to eat, how to dress, where to go. But Franklin's men did not know, and they did not try to learn. Perhaps this was the greatest mistake of the Franklin expedition: arrogance, underestimating nature, not listening to the locals. We are British, we know best, but they did not. And this ignorance led to the deaths of 129 men. In 2021, the Canadian government placed the remains of the Franklin expedition under protection. The ships were declared historical artifacts. No one could touch them. No one could remove them. They would remain there, on the seabed, forever. But the story was still alive, because the Franklin expedition was not just a historical event. It was a lesson about human nature, about our courage, about our arrogance, about our fragility. Because Franklin and his men were brave, they walked toward the unknown. They were face to face with death, and yet they kept moving forward. This is something admirable. But at the same time, they were arrogant. They believed they could control nature. They trusted technology. But nature does not care about technology. It is only powerful. It is only ruthless. And Franklin's men were fragile. Cold, disease, hunger, all of it slowly destroyed them. And in the end, none survived. Because no matter how strong a human may be, in the face of nature, he is only a speck. This lesson is still valid today. Climate change, the melting of the poles, the destruction of nature, all of it is the result of the same arrogance. We are strong. We can control it. But we cannot, because nature is stronger than us. And if we do not listen to it, like Franklin's men, we too will be lost. Perhaps this is why the story of the Franklin expedition is still told, because it is a reminder, a warning.
a lesson. Now close your eyes and imagine those ships, those men, those glaciers, and ask yourself, if I had been there, what would I have done? Would I have given up, or would I have fought? The answer is always the same. You fight, because that is the kind of creature a human is. Even when death draws near, he fights. Even when hope fades, he fights, because to fight is to live. And Franklin's men fought until their final breath. Perhaps they failed, but they were heroes, because heroism is not winning. Heroism is fighting, even when you have no chance at all. And this must not be forgotten. Now sleep. Sleep deeply, deeply, because this story is finished, but in your memory, it will remain forever. The memory of those 129 men will live on forever.
And perhaps in your dream, you will see them, walking, falling, getting back up, always fighting. Because some souls never stop. They walk forever. They search forever. They hope forever. And Franklin's men are still walking on those glaciers, in that silence, still heading south, still trying to return home. But they will never arrive, because their home is now those glaciers, forever. Good night, sweet dreams, and remember, life is short, the world is vast, and some journeys never end. But there is another side of the story that has not yet been told. The families left behind by the Franklin expedition, their pain, their waiting, their hope, and their despair. Lady Jane Franklin lived for another 12 years after the death of her husband, Sir John Franklin. But she never mourned, because in her mind, her husband was still a hero. She had monuments erected in London. She gave speeches. She organized meetings. My husband found the Northwest Passage. He succeeded, but the truth was different. Franklin did not find the Northwest Passage. He only died. But Lady Jane refused to accept it, because accepting it would have meant destroying the meaning of her life. The other families suffered similar pain. Wives, children, mothers, all of them waited for their loved ones to return, but no one came back. Only news arrived, bad news. We are sorry, they are dead. Their bodies were found. Some families wanted to bury the bodies. They wanted to bring them back to England, but it was impossible, because the bodies were frozen in the ice. They could not be removed. They would remain there forever. One mother traveled to Canada to visit her son's grave, but Beechy Island was too far, too dangerous. She could not reach it. She simply stayed at home in London, and she cried, silently, endlessly. One wife read her husband's final letter every night. "My love, I will be home soon. Do not worry. Everything is fine." But everything was not fine, and he never returned. One child never knew his father, because his father had set out before he was born. There was only one photograph, a man in uniform, smiling. This is your father. He is a hero. But the child did not want heroes. He wanted his father. The pain of the Franklin expedition was not only the pain of those 129 men. It was the pain of hundreds of families, the pain of thousands of people. And that pain lasted for years. In 1875, the British government officially declared the Franklin expedition lost. The searches would end.
Hope would end. The page was closed. But Lady Jane Franklin did not close the page. Until her death, she defended her husband's honor. He was a hero. He succeeded. He will not be forgotten. And she was right, because Sir John Franklin was not forgotten. But the reason he was remembered was not his success. It was his tragedy. In the 1880s, a Franklin Memorial was erected in London, in Westminster Abbey, a large, grand monument. There were inscriptions on it. Sir John Franklin, explorer, hero, pioneer. But beneath that monument, the truth was written. He and 128 men were lost in the Arctic, never found. That monument still stands today. People walk past it. They look, they read, and they think. What a tragic story. Because it is. The Franklin expedition is one of the most tragic stories in history, but at the same time, it is one of the most instructive stories. Because that story teaches us this: courage alone is not enough. Preparation is required. Humility is required. Respect for nature is required. And most importantly, realism is required. Franklin was brave, but he was not prepared. He was not humble. He did not respect nature, and he was not realistic. We will succeed because we are English, but he did not succeed because being English does not melt ice. And this lesson is always valid in business life, in private life, everywhere. Arrogance leads to failure. Humility leads to success.
If Franklin had not been arrogant, perhaps he would have listened to the Inuit. Perhaps he would have learned from them. Perhaps then he would have survived. But he did not listen, and he died. Today, the Arctic region is changing rapidly. Climate change is melting the ice. The Northwest Passage is now open. Ships can pass easily. Franklin's dream came true. But Franklin did not live to see it, because he died 170 years ago. But perhaps he is there now, his spirit wandering among those glaciers, and perhaps he is watching the ships as they pass through the Northwest Passage, and perhaps he is smiling. At last we succeeded. We were late, but we succeeded. Or perhaps he is sad. If only I could have seen it. If only I could have passed through as well. But he could not, because fate had been written that way, and fate can sometimes be cruel. Now close your eyes one last time and imagine those ships, those men, those glaciers, and say a prayer in your heart for Franklin and his men, because they deserve peace. 129 men, 129 lives, 129 stories, all lost in those glaciers, but they will live on forever in memory. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps being remembered is the greatest monument. Perhaps not being forgotten is the greatest success. Franklin was not forgotten, and his men were not forgotten either. They became a part of history, a tragic part, but an important part. Because they reminded us of this: no matter how strong humans are, they are weak in the face of nature. But at the same time, no matter how weak humans are, they can be brave. And courage never dies. It is passed from generation to generation. Franklin's courage lives in us today. Tomorrow it will live in our children. And so the story continues forever. Good night, sweet dreams, and remember, some stories never end because they are not just stories, they are a legacy. And Franklin's legacy will live on forever. Now sleep, a deep, peaceful sleep, because tonight's story ends here. But tomorrow, another story will begin, and that story may be your story. Who knows? Only time will tell. Good night.